Well, Donald Trump discovered today that his job does not come with the same privileges that come with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's job. Donald Trump doesn't have floor privileges. The president of the United States does have privileges that a member of Congress has. A member of the House of Representatives can enter the House chamber at any time, and a member of the House of Representatives can also enter the Senate chamber at any time. Donald Trump cannot. The president of the United States needs an invitation. And today, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi told the president, because of the government shutdown that he created, she cannot extend an invitation to him to deliver his State of the Union address in the House of Representatives to a joint session of Congress. And Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put the blame for the shutdown right where it belongs as of now, and that is in the United States Senate. And she did that by exercising her floor privileges and walking right into the United States Senate chamber to deliver a letter to Mitch McConnell telling him to bring the government funding bills that have already passed the House of Representatives to a vote in the United States Senate, where those bills would pass if Mitch McConnell would simply allow a vote. Now, House members entering the Senate chamber is a rare occurrence. Most people working in the Senate never see it happen. Most staff members never see that happen. House members entering the Senate chamber in protest, well, that's even more rare. And the way the country discovered that that was possible, that House members have the Senate floor privileges to do that, was when the then very few women members of the House of Representatives marched across the Capitol campus and invaded the floor of the United States Senate to demand that the Senate Judiciary Committee reopen the confirmation hearing of Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas so that they could hear testimony from Anita Hill about what she said was the sexual harassment she suffered from Clarence Thomas. And I was working in the Senate then at the time, and I can tell you that that hearing was not going to be reopened. That was not going to happen if the women of the House didn't do what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez decided to do today. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez is the second most famous member of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi being the most famous member. Now, we have not seen such a famous freshman member of the House since John Quincy Adams was elected to the House of Representatives after serving as our sixth president of the United States. And in modern politics, in social media politics, with fame comes power, the power to direct media attention where you want it, the power to push a policy position into the national political debate. And Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez did that today more effectively than any other member of the House of Representatives could have done it because of that fame. And there is apparently no one in the House of Representatives who understands fame and knows how to use fame better than Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, who does not need a staff to explain Instagram to her or any other social media or mass communication tool, including how she should handle herself on Stephen Colbert's show. She went to the Senate chamber looking for Mitch McConnell after she checked the majority leader's office adjacent to the Senate floor, and she was told he wasn't there, but it's a large office suite with plenty of places to hide. But what are you going to do? The staff says majority leader isn't there. Every majority leader also has a separate Senate office that is granted to him as a regular member of the Senate representing his state. And so Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez took the Senate subway over to the Russell Senate office building where McConnell's Kentucky Senate office is, a place where he rarely sets foot. Here she is on the Senate subway on the way to that office. Hashtag where's Mitch?
Okay, guys, we went to Mitch McConnell's office, where we went to the Senate cloakroom. Hashtag where's Mitch?
Here is the Congresswoman at the end of her search in the Russell Senate office building.
He's not in the cloakroom. He's not in the Capitol. He's not in the Russell building. He's not in the floor of the Senate. And 800,000 people don't have their paychecks. So where's Mitch?
Where's Mitch? He wasn't on the Senate floor. He wasn't in the cloakroom. He wasn't in any of his offices. There's one more place that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez could have gone, but it wouldn't be easy to find. There's no marking on the door. It is Mitch McConnell's hideaway. That is literally what it's called. a hideaway. Senior senators like McConnell get an extra office, some of them smaller than their official office, some of them quite grand, and they are secret rooms in the Capitol building near the Senate floor with no markings on the door, and it is the one place where a senator can go and literally hide away. Today, Mitch McConnell might have actually been using his hideaway as the place to literally hide away from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The place to hide away from the inescapable fact that this shutdown now belongs to Mitch McConnell. Donald Trump started it, and Mitch McConnell is doing everything he can to keep it going for Donald Trump. He is not using the powers of his office the way Nancy Pelosi is to solve the problem that Donald Trump handed to them. He is using the powers of his office to block a solution to the shutdown. And so the shutdown continues. And because a State of the Union address takes enormous planning by the Speaker of the House and by the House Sergeant at Arms and by the Capitol Police and hundreds of government workers who have to coordinate to provide security and logistics for a 21st century State of the Union address, many of whom are not currently being paid, those workers, Nancy Pelosi has decided she cannot demand that the federal workforce necessary to support a televised State of the Union address from the House of Representatives be ordered to work without pay. And so, Speaker Pelosi sent a letter to the president today saying, quote, given the security concerns, and unless government reopens this week, I suggest that we work together to determine another suitable date after government has reopened for this address, for you to consider delivering your State of the Union address in writing to Congress on January 29th. Now, actually, most State of the Union addresses delivered by most presidents have been delivered in writing only. But that changed in the 20th century when Woodrow Wilson delivered his State of the Union addresses in person as a speech to a joint session of Congress. And every president after him has done the same thing. Those speeches became ultimately delivered to national audiences on radio and then on television. And then Donald Trump shut down the government and may have pushed the presidential State of the Union address back into the 19th century. In comments to reporters today, Nancy Pelosi suggested the president had another option if he doesn't want to just deliver his State of the Union address in writing.
You can make it from the Oval Office if you want.
And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer supports Speaker Pelosi's decision.
Well, what is the State of the Union? The government is closed because of President Trump. If it continues to be closed on the 29th, I think it's a good idea to delay it till the government is open.
Joining our discussion now, Ron Klain, a former senior advisor to Joe Biden and President Obama and the former chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Claire McCaskill, former Democratic senator from Missouri, who is now an MSNBC political analyst. I won't ask you where your hideaway was.
And by the way, all senators have them out.
Yeah.
Once they open the convention center.
Oh, it used to be just the senior.
Right.
Yeah.
But when they opened the convention center, the new facility
There's
that
more
moved
space.
a lot of offices out of the Capitol, which gave space for every senator to have a hideaway.
Now, let's just for a moment. It's not as bad as it sounds.
No,
a lot of productive work gets done by senators in the hideaways. It's where you can read, it's where you can think, and occasionally take a nap between those votes in the middle of the night. So
But,
it's not.
Yeah, no, and most of the time it's used when we're voting late at night.
Yeah, because it's close to the floor.
Right. Or if you need to do a quick meeting and you can't get all the way back over to your office in Hart and you need to stay in the Capitol complex because of other things that are going on. So, but the name is really tacky. I mean, we need to change the name. And it is weird because they won't even tell senators where another senator's hideaway is.
That's right.
I mean, the only way you find out where someone's hideaway is if the senator tells you where it is.
You get invited.
Yeah, right. It is. Right. It's a culture that probably needs to be
and some of them are quite magnificent. We could go on and on about this.
Yeah, we could.
Ron Klain, during the break, after the next commercial break, we're all going to talk about what's the most impressive hideaway we've seen in the Senate. So Nancy Pelosi, when the president shuts down the government, goes to work. And she says, our job is legislating, our job is funding the government. That's the Congress's job to fund the government. She goes to work and she funds the government. She passes bills to fund the government.
Right.
Those bills get sent to the United States Senate.
Correct.
Nothing happens. That's where the shutdown is now, isn't it?
It's Mitch McConnell. He's been looking at his shoes and hiding under his desk from day one. Remember, he got 100 votes. for a bill to get the funding through. 100 votes, unanimous in the Senate. Mitch McConnell did that. He did that because he'd gotten an agreement from the president.
Before the shutdown.
Right.
Yeah.
He got an agreement from the president that he would sign it. Well, then a couple, Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter got on their shows and, gave him what for, and he then reversed course. He backed up the truck and said, no, I won't sign it. So Mitch knew from the beginning this was going to have a bad ending. So Mitch's goal was very simple. I don't want to be anywhere near this. So if you remember, he immediately started saying, this is about the Democrats and the president. This is about the Democrats and the president. And you got to give him this. The polling shows that only about 5 to 6 or 7% are blaming the Republicans in Congress. They're blaming Trump. And what Mitch McConnell is doing is trying to protect his members, those that are up for election in 2020 in tough states. He doesn't want them to have to take this vote because he knows they're going to have a tough road to run in terms of winning in 2020. If we don't put more pressure on him, and I applaud what the Congresswoman did today, we all need to be putting pressure because if Mitch McConnell wanted to get this done, he could get it done tomorrow.
Yeah, and Ron Klain, some of these individual senators are going to come under increasingly enormous pressure. Johnny Isakson, Republican from Georgia, said an extraordinary thing today. He said that the way to get this shutdown to end, and he represents one of our most important airports, the Atlanta airport, obviously, major hub, major factor in all of the economy of Georgia. He wants to see, he's advocating a strike by TSA agents, including at his airport, so that will force the president. Now, let's consider what this is. He's advocating an illegal strike by federal workers because he is afraid. He is afraid of himself doing his own job that he's paid to do and cast a vote in the United States Senate.
Yeah, it's crazy, Lawrence. I mean, look, to win approval for his 14th century wall, President Trump may have backed himself into a 19th century State of the Union address, as you said at the outset of the program. But, look, Trump is kind of in some ways delivering on what he promised us. He said he would run the government the way he ran the Trump Organization. He's got hundreds of thousands of workers who he's not paying. He's got contractors who he's stiffing. He's got a giant disaster, the Trump shutdown that he's put his name on top of. I mean, this is what we would have expected from Donald Trump. He's the most incompetent president in history, and his incompetence is kind of the driving force behind this shutdown.
I've just been handed the breaking news from the New York Times tonight, the latest inside the Trump White House report of what the president is thinking about this. And I think you might be able to help the president with this, Senator McCaskill. This is Maggie Haberman and Annie Carney with their sources inside the White House reporting what Donald Trump is saying. And he is saying, we are getting crushed. Mr. Trump told his acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, after watching some recent coverage of the shutdown. According to one person familiar with the conversation, why can't we get a deal? You want to answer that for the president?
Well, it's pretty simple. He should have taken yes for an answer. His administration asked for $1.6 billion. We gave them $1.6 billion. That's all they asked for.
And when you say we, this was done before the shutdown, before Christmas, way back when Claire McCaskill was still a senator.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so, this is what's nuts about this. Give Nancy Pelosi, what a badass. Her realizing that she could remove the invitation for the State of the Union. I think it was a brilliant political play. It made sense. It was reasonable. I think most people think it's reasonable. And once again, she has outmaneuvered him in terms of leveraging the situation. He is not going to get $5 billion for a sea to shining sea wall. And the sooner he realizes that and figures another way out of this, and Mitch McConnell's the guy who can do it.
And Ron, another thing about withdrawing the invitation for the State of the Union, we've all seen, you worked in the Senate, and Senator McCaskill knows this, we've all seen how many people go into overdrive and overtime to put together what it takes to deliver a State of the Union in the 21st century with all the security that takes. Most of those people aren't being paid. Nancy Pelosi is saying this is not an emergency. Under a shutdown work rules, it's only supposed to be basically emergency critical personnel who are working. We can't say to them that this speech is the kind of emergency that must bring them back from home into work for this. I don't see how she could actually justify it if she wanted to make the case that it is an emergency for us to hear from Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's a stunning thing to think about the amount of security and logistics that go into the State of the Union address. You have sitting in one room, obviously the president, all members of his cabinet except one who is off in a secure location, the entire Supreme Court, and obviously the entire House and Senate. Our entire government sits in one room for one night a year. It is obviously the highest risk security event we have every single year. And so the number of people who it takes to secure that, to deal with the transportation logistics of getting these people back and forth, and all these things, it's just an enormous number. And to ask those people to work for no pay, which is the Trump proposition right now, is ridiculous. I think Nancy Pelosi did something very smart as far as it went. She should have gone the rest of the way. She might as well just have invited Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh to deliver the State of the Union address, because they appear to be running our country right now. Whatever they say goes with Trump. And, you know, like they appear to be the highest authority in the United States.
Claire, let me, Senator McCaskill, let me
Claire's
explain.
great.
Claire, I'm going back to before your Senate days when we first met.
Exactly.
I want to use that. But just so you understand, Ron Klain is both possibly has the most one of the thickest resumes of anyone who appears on this show, having worked for President, Vice President, Senate Judiciary Committee, Justice Department. But he is our resident stand-up comedian. And so he's the one who's going to do the Ann Coulter give the State of the Union address joke. I just want to make it clear, because there's no, laughing audience here.
Yeah. Okay. Done.
Yeah, that was
right?
a joke. Yeah,
okay.
right.
Got it.
Senator Claire McCaskill in her debut as a former senator on The Last Word. Thank you for starting us off tonight. Ron Klain, thank you for joining us. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.